Welcome back to part 2 of this beginning photography tutorial. And today we're going to take a look at a lot of the camera parts and settings within the camera. So our first thing that we have here is kind of our older camera. We've got the DSLR. So DSLR stands for digital single lens reflex. And what happens in this camera, and I'm not going to show it because look, these are fading out, but basically we have an optical viewfinder instead of a digital, like a TV screen finder. The light comes through the lens, reflects off a mirror through a prism, and then you see the image. So that's the digital single lens reflex. When you take a picture, the mirror pops up, the shutter opens, you take the picture, shutter closes, mirror closes, and you're done. With a mirrorless camera, it's a little bit different. We don't have that mirror, so you don't have that clunk that you hear when you use a DSLR. But a lot of people still have DSLRs and might be using DSLRs, so we're going to go ahead and take a look and cover some of these aspects. So we talked about the exposure triangle, and one of the things we need to know for some of you, if you haven't looked at your manual, how in the world do you change the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO on your camera? And it's different for every camera, and even within brands, it can differ. So I just have some basic cameras up here. You might have a different camera, and it might set up a little bit different, so you might have to refer to a manual or maybe a video that's specific on your camera. But you should find these options everywhere. Up here, we have our shutter speed dial, and on a Canon camera, you can't see it on this back, but this is our shutter button, and this little dial right here that you spin control both your shutter speed and your aperture on this Canon Rebel camera. Now, as you get more sophisticated cameras and DSLR, you'll have independent buttons. So this would be a shutter, and then you'd most likely have a wheel or something back here. On my camera, it's a wheel, and I spin it, and that changes the aperture. Now, on a Canon DSLR, we have something kind of funky. We have a toggle switch. So normally this changes our shutter, but if we hold this in, and usually you're going to be using your thumb, then when you spin this, it becomes your aperture button. So it takes a little bit of time to get used to. I would even struggle for this, but we don't have two different buttons. The newer Canon Rebel cameras actually have a separate button back here on this dial that you can use. So that's nice that they finally got rid of it, even on the cheaper model cameras. Wonderful. And I think we'll see that on the Canon digital camera. So our ISO adjustment is right here. Some of the new cameras have touch screens, and you can also change your ISO through the touch screen. You might not see an independent button on the back of the camera. That's because you're doing it through a touch screen. Let's move on. All right, so our next camera here is a Canon mirrorless camera, and we can just barely up there see him. He's a little shutter dial button, and that's what you're going to change to control your shutter speed. Our next option is aperture or f-stop dial. So this thing right here is what you will use to control or change your aperture on the camera. So there's no toggle switch. And our ISO adjustment right here, we would click that, and then you would use this dial up here to spin, and you can control your ISO. I haven't used this exact camera, so you might tap this and spin this dial as well. I'm not sure. Either way, that's how you're going to change it. Most likely, you're going to spin this dial. Next thing we have is a Sony mirrorless camera. So our shutter speed dial on this camera is this button right here. This is the command dial. This is our shutter speed. So we're going to spin that. And just so you know, different manufacturers spin different directions. All right, so some are clockwise and some are counterclockwise. ISO adjustment, you would tap this and most likely spin this dial to change it. Otherwise, you would spin this dial to change it. And our last thing is our aperture. And so for aperture, you would spin or rotate this dial to change your aperture on your camera. Last of all, we have a Nikon mirrorless camera. So up here, we've got our shutter speed dial. Right here, you're going to tap this info panel, and the info panel is going to let you change more than your ISO. There's a whole bunch of stuff. So this is a pretty beneficial button. You're going to need to learn to use it. You would tap this, and then you'd be able to tap your ISO on your touch screen, and then you can change it from there. And our last thing is our aperture or f-stop. So you would rotate this dial or tap this dial to adjust that aperture. All right, so we are back to that Canon DSLR, and we're going to take a look at some common camera buttons or settings or options that you have on most all cameras. Our first thing up here is called a diopter, and usually you're going to see this little dial right here, and it's got a plus and minus. And this is for people that wear glasses. Now, this won't correct for major vision issues. If you need to take your glasses off, look through the viewfinder. This can help correct for vision issues. What you need to do is look through your viewfinder, focus on a subject, and then rotate that until it looks most in focus. And then I would tell you to use this. Get yourself some gaffer's tape, not duct tape, because duct tape won't come off. Gaffer's tape will. And put a little piece of tape over that because you're going to move it all the time. I move mine all the time on accident. So a little piece of gaffer's tape will stop it from moving. You can also put a little piece of gaffer's tape on the eyepiece. These eyepieces pop off, go up this way. Sometimes they're loose. They've gotten better over the years, but you'll see a lot of photographers with a little piece of gaffer's tape holding that down so it doesn't pop off. Our next button down here is the aperture toggle switch that we have. So these other icons are for exposure compensation and to delete images. Our ISO right here. We have autofocus. So if you want to change between your autofocus modes, and these autofocus modes we haven't got into, these are for single, where the camera focuses and then stops, then continuous, where for like tracking, for if you were shooting football or sports, it would follow a subject. And then it usually has some sort of AI where it picks. The newer cameras have auto subject tracking and auto eye tracking for both people and dogs. Next, WB, not for Warner Brothers. This is for white balance. This is going to allow you to change the white balance in your camera. And we're going to look at more at white balance in just a little bit. This button over here is your drive. And so if you want to put your camera on timer, you can do it here. Or if you want single, which would be every time you press the shutter button, it takes a picture, or continuous, if you hold it down, click, 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 it will take a series of photos as long as you hold that shutter button down. So those are some of your basic camera settings that you're going to find on all cameras. They're just going to be in different locations. Our next slide here is RAW versus JPEG. And basically you have two main options when taking photographs as far as your format. It's RAW and JPEG. All right, some of the common RAW file types are CR2 and CR3. Those are Canon. NEF, that is Nikon. ORG, maybe that's Olympus. ARW, Sony. And DNG, which is Adobe's digital negative. The file extension, obviously, for JPEG is JPEG. And there's major differences between the two. RAW files are a capture, meaning you set your settings, you take a picture, and the camera just saves the capture. The image does not get processed. In a JPEG, what happens is you take the picture and it applies all the settings that you've put on your camera. So if you want it to shoot an sRGB, whatever you have set on your camera, it's going to process that and then save it. So the difference is two things. One, most RAW files are lossless, meaning that they save every pixel. Lossy compression is a little bit different, meaning a JPEG photo takes a photo, but it doesn't save every pixel. So if you're wearing an all black shirt, it's not going to remember every black pixel on your shirt. When it saves the image, it's going to delete some of that information, and when it opens it, it's going to put it back in. So you can lose a little bit of detail by doing this, but in RAW files, they do have a new compressed RAW where it's slightly compressed and you do lose a little bit of information, but in general, a RAW file is saving all data. RAW files have a larger color gamut and bit depth. Okay? So you don't apply those until after the fact. So all RAW files need to go through a program like Adobe Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, which you don't know are exactly the same program when it comes to the develop module. They're raw processors. There are other raw processors through different manufacturers. Canon and Nikon probably have their own software to do that if you would like it, but you do need to have that to process raw photos. JPEGs you can pretty much view on any computer because anything reads that JPEG file. So the color gamut is how many colors or how much colors the capture is able to gain. So you're limited in JPEG basically to either the sRGB or the Adobe RGB color gamut. But the bit depth is much greater in a raw file. So we're going to take a look more in depth here at raw bit depth. So we're not going to go into it right this second. So post-processing adjustments, meaning if you take a raw file and your white balance and your exposure is a little bit off, you can actually slide it before the image gets processed. So you can fix a lot of minor issues that you get. And most people will be shocked at the amount of adjustment you can get out of a raw photo. The last thing is a raw file. You can't overwrite that file. So a raw file can't be accidentally overwritten. So when you process it and you edit it, it makes the adjustments in what we call an XMP file. And we'll get into that later, but it never physically changes that original raw file. It's always saving it in a different spot. A JPEG, if you shoot something and then you size it down to 14 pixels and accidentally save over the original's gone. There's nothing you can do. So not great. Yeah, you're going to have smaller file sizes in a JPEG. So if file size is an issue and you don't care about the other stuff, feel free to shoot in JPEG. JPEG is going to give you a really, really nice image as long as your white balance and your exposure are right on the money, because you can't really fix them that well after the fact. In my opinion, I only shoot RAW. I will never shoot JPEG. So if you're asking my opinion, RAW is the way to go. So let's take a look at what in the world is color bit depth. Now, Photoshop only works in 8 and 16 bits. At this point, none of the DSLR cameras shoot in 16-bit yet. Most are in 12 or 14-bit, okay? Though we work in 16-bit, you're only going to have the bit depth of whatever your camera shoots in, whether that's 10, 12, 14, whatever it is, that's going to be your bit depth. So don't think because you're working in 16-bit that you're going to get this many trillion colors. It's going to be less than that, but it's going to be more than that here. So an 8-bit image uses 16 million, almost 17 million colors. Basically, if you think of it in shades of gray, it's 256 shades of gray. Over here, 12-bit image is 68 billion colors. So we went from 17 million to basically 69 billion colors. That's a lot more data. So this is where shooting that raw file is important, because when all that extra data, as you adjust it or manipulate it, you're not changing it as much as you are here. Now, the trick with this stuff is, yes, your final image that you're going to output to the web or print is most likely still going to be an 8-bit image. However, if you edit in a 16-bit mode with whatever bit your camera is, if you edit higher bit depth, as you manipulate that data, it's just going to be a smoother transition or a smoother gradation. Eventually, of course, you are going to size down to 8 bits because most things are in 8-bit as far as an image on the web or a print. But it's better to have more data than it is to have less data. 12-bit is basically 69 billion colors. And then if you're in 16-bit, we're at 281 trillion colors. So basically, this is what you get from a JPEG image, and somewhere in between here is what you're going to get when you shoot RAW. where in the world are the image quality settings to do this? So this is inside of a Canon, I think, in an older Canon. And what this stuff means is compression. So this is a large JPEG, and this means that it has less compression. So you're losing or throwing out less data. This is more compressed. You do not want to do that. All right. This is a medium-sized image with the better compression, less compression, and a small image. I have no idea why anybody would use this stuff here. Just shoot in large, fine. This is what you have right here. The next thing that we have over here is RAW. We have RAW and C-RAW. And look, different cameras might call this something just a little bit different, but we have basic RAW, which is an uncompressed RAW, and we have a compressed RAW. This will give you a little bit smaller file size. Some cameras will actually let you shoot both, so you can shoot RAW and JPEG. So every image you take, it's going to have a JPEG and a RAW. So if that's something you're interested in, that's an option. Full frame versus cropped sensors. So most of your beginner cameras are going to be a cropped sensor, meaning the size of the sensor is smaller, and it is typically called APS-C. This is your size, 23.6 millimeters by 15.6 millimeters, and it's essentially about this size. So when you're taking photos, lenses made for a full frame lens, you need to multiply the focal length. And I know this is a little bit difficult, so I did it over here. So if you have a 30 millimeter lens on a cropped sensor camera, you need to multiply it. And look, different cameras are different. When we're going to go by 1.6, your lens says it's 30 millimeter, but in actuality, it's actually a 48 millimeter because it multiplies that focal length. If you have a full frame camera, which is more of your intermediate and advanced cameras, you're going to be 36 by 24 millimeters. And if you have a 30 millimeter lens, it's going to be a 30 millimeter lens. There's no multiplication factor. Full frame, most people will consider better. But look, the crop sensor beginning DSLR cameras are incredible these days. All right, so I told you before, we're going to take a look at white balance. And this is kind of funny because guess what? I don't change white balance anymore. And I do that for basically the reason that I can do this in post-processing because I shoot RAW. So if you shoot JPEG, you need to set one of these on your camera and get it looking as good as possible because it gets embedded or processed like I told you earlier, and you can change it, but not as well as you can if you shoot a RAW file. So with auto white balance, I can set any of these after the fact in post-processing, which would be Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, and set any of these and try to get that image looking just like I saw it or want it to be. And not only can you use the presets, but you also have little sliders so you can further refine it from there. But let's take a look at the different ones. So we have daylight, shadow, cloudy, tungsten, fluorescent, flash. You can do a custom white balance and user defined, meaning you're just setting the Kelvin temperature. In photography, we measure the color of light in Kelvin. So if you remember Earth science back in high school, that's the Kelvin temperature. And so around 5,500 is a neutral white, all right? Usually daylight is somewhere around 6,500, so it's going to be a little bluer than normal daylight. It kind of depends on what time of day you're considering the daylight is. But I have some little examples over here. So cloudy, your Kelvin temperature is going to be around 6,000. So your image is going to be a little cyan or blue. Daylight around 5,500 and strobe, they're either balanced for 5,500 Kelvin or 5,000 Kelvin. So they might be a little on the warm side. Fluorescent is balanced at around 4,000. Tungsten, which is your old time light bulbs, 3,200 Kelvin. No, I do not have LEDs on here. And your candlelight would be around 2,000 Kelvin. So you can see from neutral, as it gets a higher Kelvin temperature, it gets more blue, and as it gets warmer as it goes down. So the way this works, and you can see here, is basically these sets are just setting a predetermined or a preset as far as a Kelvin scale. So Shadow's going to set it at about 7,000 to help compensate for that blue light, and that's going to warm it up and try to make it more neutral. All right, custom white balance, you go through a little process and you can do a custom white balance or something. And Kelvin, you're just adjusting the Kelvin temperature. When you have one light source, this works really well. However, if you have two completely different light sources, like light coming through a window and then lights inside of a building, and you're inside the building, you're going to have what we call mixed lighting. And it can be difficult to get the white balance in both locations to look good. So basically on the main subject, I will use this and try to get the white balance correct. And then you might have to make a selection inside of a photo editing program to adjust that background color. So let's take a little bit of a look. So these are pictures of my dogs. And what I did is just go through the different presets so you could see what they look like. These are unedited images. These are the raw files. So this is how I shot it. So when I went to auto, you can see in auto, this is strange because usually auto makes things a little bit warmer, but in this, it made it more of a neutral color. Now, this is closer to what it looked like when I shot it because it was kind of the sun going down. So this is incorrect. So auto usually is my first step that I'll test something out. And if that looks good, I'll use it. Then we have daylight, and you can see it's very close to as shot. Then our shade, then tungsten and fluorescent. So you can see how it's manipulating and changing those images. So I'm a stickler for this one, and I've been using it for at least 25 years, or as long as it's been on a camera, as far as I can remember. And that is rear or back button focus. And so this is the problem. So this is the issue. All cameras, you start off with the shutter button being your autofocus button. It also takes the picture. It also turns on the meter. So the way you would do it is you would press the button halfway down, your camera would focus, and then you would either take the picture or hold that button halfway down and recompose and then take the picture. The problem is it's really difficult to do. And what happens is, as someone is learning photography, they'll press that button halfway down, and then when they want to take the picture, they'll actually lift up and press down the whole way. And that automatically refocuses, and sometimes it refocuses on infinity, and yeah, your image is out of focus. So what we're doing by going to this button on the back, in which you would use your thumb, is we're giving it an independent button. So if we press the button, it's focusing, and we don't press it, it stops focusing. That's the way I use focus, but this is the rear autofocus button. How you change it is different on every camera. And so what I normally do is turn it off here and turn it on here. All right, so the next slide here, we have some suggested basic camera settings. And look, we're gonna get into more settings as we evolve and move on to more advanced videos in this series. So, image quality raw. Drive continuous high. And that means when you press your shutter button down, click, 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 click. It's because you don't know what's going to happen in life. And even though you might be taking a picture of a person who's not moving, something might happen that's really funny and you want to get that moment. So you've all seen where the bride's backing up and falls into the river. That's what we're talking about. Autofocus continuous servo. And so we just talked about a second ago, we had single and continuous servo. I use continuous because I use that back button. Autofocus button on the rear. Autofocus single point, eye tracking, or subject tracking. We will get more into this later, but single point is just like a little single dot in the center. It's not an expanded autofocus button. I prefer that, the single point, the eye tracking, or subject tracking, because they are more accurate. Auto lighting optimizer on Canon, deactive lighting on Nikon, and dynamic range optimizer on Sony, turn it off. Basically, it tries to auto-tone your image for you. We don't want that. We want to have control. Highlight alert. If you have this, this is great. If you overexpose your highlights, they blink so you can see that you've overexposed them. This is great when you're out in sunlight and you can't see your image too well. Sometimes they look like they're exposed well, but if it's blinking red, that's what color mine blinks. I know I've accidentally a little too hot on that, and I will darken that image. Auto ISO, I turn off. However, auto ISO is the only semi-automatic mode I use. I do not use shutter priority or aperture priority. What I'll do is set my shutter and my aperture and let the ISO adjust. But by default, your camera is going to come with auto ISO on. It's going to be beneficial and you're going to struggle with this, but to turn that off and manually set it, that's going to help you learn the photographic process. Later, if you want to turn it back on, turn it back on. And if you're shooting JPEG, switch to the color profile of Adobe. Default is going to be sRGB, but Adobe is a larger color gamut. So I would get more colors while you can. You can easily, in any program, convert it back over to sRGB. All right, the command dial. And so this is a dial usually on top of your camera that lets you set different things. So the first one that we have is M, and that is manual, meaning you are going to manually set your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO if you've turned auto ISO off. The next option is S or TV. I have no idea why they use TV on Canon, but they do. And this is shutter priority. Shutter priority means you set the shutter speed you want, and the camera will set the aperture to get the correct exposure. Aperture priority is the opposite. So you're going to set the aperture and the camera is going to set the shutter speed to get the correct exposure. Auto. And a lot of people have trouble with this because both of these are basically fully automatic. We have auto and program. Our last one is P, and it looks like I have a J in front of the word program. Hopefully I'll fix that in the video. But the difference between the two is auto does everything for you. You just set it and you take the pictures. What happens, a lot of the ability to override the camera is turned off. It won't let you do it. Program, it's still a fully automatic, but it does allow you to override certain functions on the camera as you're taking photos. Let's go on to the next slide. So the next thing that we have are these scene modes. And look, these are the most basic scenes. Some cameras have lots of them, but what they exactly are presets. Therefore, people that don't know how to use the camera, and when you're in auto mode or a program mode, the camera doesn't know what you're photographing. So if something's running, the camera's not going to know to set a fast shutter speed to stop that action. So that's where scene modes come in. So our first one is macro, this little flower, and it optimizes settings to take macro photographs. Landscape, it's going to optimize the settings to take landscape photographs, meaning it's going to set a high aperture so you have a high depth of field. You have a night portrait mode, and a lot of times this is going to turn on your flash, so your flash comes on and illuminates the subject in the front. You're going to have a portrait mode, which is going to set a shallow depth of field, and fast action, which is going to set that high shutter speed. Now, the trick is a lot of times the camera might set fast shutter speed, but not fast enough. Or you might get a shallow depth of field in portrait, but maybe not shallow enough. So it helps to know what the camera is doing so that you can look at the settings if you're shooting in these modes to make sure it's what you want to achieve. So that's it for part 2 of this series. Found this helpful and could give us a thumbs up, that would be great. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below, and don't forget to subscribe.